John and Susan Hamilton met in 1985 in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, when Susan, a single mother and devout Christian, worked as a nurse. John, a prominent OB/GYN, was known for his charismatic personality and dedication to his career. Their paths crossed at a medical event, and they quickly developed a close relationship, with John drawn to Susan's kindness and strong values. The couple married shortly after, and despite some ups and downs, they remained together for over 15 years, with Susan supporting John in both his career and personal challenges. John Hamilton was already a father, which is why they didn't plan to have more children. They enjoyed life as much as they could, and they were able to afford many luxuries. They liked living at a high standard of living, enjoying expensive vacations, romantic dinners, and luxurious gifts. John spared no expense when it came to buying extravagant presents for Susan. He was very kind to her and took good care of her, and Susan returned his love. She loved him deeply. Less than 2 years later, in 1987, they married. They lived in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, where John had a successful medical practice as an obstetrician and gynecologist. The couple shared a spacious, upscale home in a well-regarded neighborhood in the city, reflecting John's success and their comfortable lifestyle. It seemed that Susan and John Hamilton were the perfect couple. Many people envied their lives, believing they had it all: love, money, and nothing was missing. They got along great, enjoyed each other's company, and had a lot of fun together. Susan's friends would often look at her with envy, seeing her as having everything. John was known for lavishing Susan with expensive gifts as signs of his affection and to maintain their relationship. Among the most notable gifts he bought for her were luxury cars, such as a Porsche, and extravagant jewelry, including diamond necklaces and rings. To the couple's friends, it seemed their life was nothing but happiness, joy, and luxury. John worked as an obstetrician and gynecologist in Oklahoma City. He owned and operated his own medical practice, specializing in women's reproductive health. Alongside his practice, John was also involved in performing abortions at a local clinic, a role that occasionally drew controversy and threats from anti-abortion activists. This aspect of his work added significant stress to his life, as he faced opposition and even received threats from extremist groups. Nevertheless, he was seen as a kind and well-respected individual, and Susan also enjoyed a good reputation among their acquaintances. Initially, Susan worked as a nurse before meeting John, and her career was focused on caregiving and the medical field. However, after marrying John, Susan stepped away from her nursing career to focus on their marriage and home life. She became deeply involved in her church community, where she was well regarded and actively participated in various activities. Her role as a devoted wife and her involvement in the church shaped her reputation and relationships. Their beautiful home and John's clinic were located not far from each other, just about a 10-minute drive. In fact, John's women's health clinic was very close to their home. One dark cloud hanging over their days was the issue of abortion. John faced protests and backlash, primarily due to his work performing abortions at a local clinic in Oklahoma City. Anti-abortion activists frequently targeted him, making him a focal point for protests. These protests included picketing outside the clinic, distributing flyers with his name and photo, and in some cases, sending threatening messages to him and his family. Susan reportedly received troubling phone calls and was even said to fear for her life due to these threats. Despite these pressures, they were still seen as the perfect couple, and they did everything they could to present a happy and untroubled image. John funded extravagant trips to exotic destinations for his wife, showered her with gifts, and frequently complimented her. They also hosted numerous parties and were well liked by many people. Unfortunately, this idyllic life came to an end on February 14, 2001. It was Valentine's Day, so John hadn't forgotten about his wife, whom he loved very much. He always made an effort to ensure this day was special and romantic. Every year, They exchanged heartfelt love cards, and despite being 14 years into their marriage, it seemed that 55-year-old Susan and 52-year-old John would spend another lovely Valentine's together. Unfortunately, it was to be their last Valentine's Day. On that tragic day, when John arrived home, he noticed the door was open, a rare occurrence. The house was eerily quiet. John looked around and eventually checked the bathroom, where he was met with a horrifying sight. His wife, Susan, was lying in a pool of blood. Despite the shock, he remained composed enough to immediately call 911. "Please, send police. Please send an ambulance, please," he cried. "I think my wife is dead." He said he had attempted CPR. "Please send somebody quick," he begged. When paramedics arrived, they were faced with a gruesome scene. John claimed he had returned home to find Susan lying in a pool of blood on the bathroom floor. She had been strangled with 2 ties belonging to John, and her head had been smashed with such force that parts of her brain were exposed. The weapon used was never found. John was covered in his wife's blood and was hysterical, staring at her disfigured face. Who could have committed such a brutal act? According to John Hamilton's version of events on February 14, 2001, the timeline unfolded as follows. Morning, around 7 a.m. John left home to go to the hospital where he had surgery, scheduled. He was in regular street clothes and changed into his scrubs at the hospital. Around 8:40 a.m. After the surgery, John briefly returned home. He said he dropped off flowers and a Valentine's Day card for Susan, but he didn't find her at the time. Around 9 a.m., John left again to return to the hospital for another scheduled surgery. After completing the second surgery, John claimed he returned home again and discovered his wife's body in the bathroom. He immediately called 911, reporting that he had tried CPR but was unable to revive her. When police arrived at the scene, they noticed 2 cars parked in the driveway, a white Corvette and a beige Jaguar XJ6. Upon entering the house, the officers were struck by the horrific scene, which seemed to suggest a crime committed by someone out of control, driven by intense hatred for Susan. They couldn't fathom who could have done such a thing, or why Susan would have been subjected to such a brutal death. At the crime scene, John's shirt and shoes were covered in blood, and blood was also found in his Jaguar. John became the primary suspect, as he was the last person to see his wife alive and the first to arrive at the crime scene. Later that day, on February 14, 2001, he was arrested. During questioning, John appeared extremely distressed, to the point where it was almost impossible to calm him. His erratic behaviour and inability to sit still seemed odd, leading some to suspect that he was acting, though others attributed it to shock and stress. Law enforcement remained sceptical, unsure whether they were dealing with a murderer or an innocent person in shock. It's important to note that from the outset, police had ruled out the possibility of a robbery or a crime of opportunity. Despite the fact that the Hamiltons' front door was left open, something that was unusual in their affluent neighbourhood, neighbours had never seen anyone suspicious lingering around or entering their home. Additionally, nothing appeared to have been stolen, despite the presence of many valuable items, including expensive jewellery. However, it was later discovered that a marble figurine was missing from the bathroom. It was suspected that this figurine might have been used as a weapon to strike Susan, but the figurine was never found. Nonetheless, the missing item didn't indicate a robbery, so the police turned their attention to other possible motives. One theory was that someone from the group of protesters regularly gathered outside their home and clinic might have had a vendetta against John because of his involvement in performing abortions. The protests had been ongoing, and there had been threats directed at the couple. However, no evidence was found to support this theory. The police thoroughly searched the Hamilton home and John's car for any clues or evidence. During the search, they found a Valentine's Day card written by Susan to John. The message she wrote struck them as strange and unsettling. "Obviously, I bought this before last Monday, so I guess now it doesn't seem as appropriate. I do still love you, though. Have a good day. Susan." This note became a turning point in the investigation. It raised questions and made the police suspicious. They decided to look more closely into John Hamilton's behaviour and whether everything in his marriage was truly as perfect as it appeared. It soon became clear that things weren't as ideal as they seemed. One of Susan's friends pointed out that John might have been having an affair. If this were true, it would mean that John had a lot to hide. It also emerged that sometime before her death, Susan had confessed to her daughter during a phone conversation that she was overwhelmed by her marriage. She felt that everything revolved around John, who always wanted to be the centre of attention and ignored her opinions. She had even considered leaving him. Susan felt trapped in the marriage and longed for change, to feel appreciated and noticed. It seemed that John's perfect image was just a facade. Detectives uncovered many details that painted John in a negative light. It appeared that Susan had likely discovered the affair several weeks before Valentine's Day, which may have been why the note she wrote to him seemed so odd. The police discovered that Susan had been collecting evidence of the affair. She had printed out a record of over 60 phone calls John had made to his lover, a stripper from a nearby club. One of Susan's friends revealed that Susan had told her husband that she knew about the affair and was planning to divorce him. John, however, denied the affair, claiming the woman was just a patient at the hospital. Susan didn't believe him, and she was determined not to let it go. This likely didn't sit well with John. A divorce and a public affair would ruin his reputation. John denied the affair, but the police found evidence to the contrary. He had visited the stripper at her workplace multiple times, and she had even performed private dances for him. John could no longer deny the affair. Despite this, John continued to claim that nothing physical had happened between them. However, the police, now more suspicious of his involvement in Susan's death, knew they needed more evidence to confirm their suspicions. Adding to the intrigue, the police found a letter that John had supposedly sent to his alleged patient, who was actually the stripper, telling her that he could no longer be her doctor. It raised the question, was John planning to remain a faithful husband, or was he just trying to lull Susan into a false sense of security? He seemed more concerned about the consequences of a divorce than preserving the marriage. The police were very suspicious of John, but it wasn't just them. Journalists and the media were also deeply interested in the case. They too felt that something wasn't quite right. One of the television stations even sent a recording of John's conversation with the emergency dispatcher to a stress analyst to examine his voice for signs of stress. The results of the analysis were revealing. The stress in his voice was minimal, suggesting he was not agitated. It sounded as though he had rehearsed what he was going to say. The police also had doubts about whether John had really performed CPR on Susan. There was no blood around his mouth or face, and given Susan's injuries, there would have been a significant amount of blood. The blood found in John's car was also analysed, and it was confirmed that it belonged to Susan. Moreover, there were her hairs present as well. The police wondered how this blood got there, since John had immediately called 911 after finding Susan. John explained this by claiming he had moved his car so that emergency responders would have room to park when they arrived. Now, turning to the blood found on John's shirt and shoes, the police sent them to one of the best forensic analysts specialising in blood spatter analysis. The expert thoroughly examined the distribution of blood on his clothes and compared it to the crime scene and John's movements. What they found was significant. The blood on John's clothes, as well as that in his car, all belonged to Susan, but there was much more blood in the car than initially thought, along with pieces of Susan's tissue. This pointed to the conclusion that John had tried to clean up the blood attempting to remove traces, but he hadn't done so thoroughly. This was a clear indication that John had tried to cover up his tracks. As the investigation progressed, it became increasingly likely that John had murdered his wife. The motive seemed to be that she wanted a divorce, something that would ruin his reputation. Given the affair, a divorce would have caused significant damage to his public image. John likely believed that killing Susan was the only way to preserve the life he had built. It was believed that John initially tried to strangle Susan with his ties, but ultimately he struck her in the head. When she fell unconscious, he finished her off by crushing her head and face. This is not how a loving husband behaves. That much was clear. The investigation also revealed that John had lied when he said he had found Susan when he returned home after the second surgery. In reality, things had been difficult in their marriage for some time. The truth was that on the morning of February 14th, John had gone home after completing his first surgery. There, he got into an argument with Susan, which led to the murder. However, before he could finish cleaning up the crime scene, he was called back to the hospital for a second surgery, which disrupted his plans. At that point, he had to leave the house and head to the hospital, which gave him less time to cover up the crime scene. He quickly changed his clothes so that he wouldn't have blood on him, and then, as though nothing had happened, returned to the hospital to perform the next surgery. Later, he pretended he was going home to pick up his schedule, and his entire call to 911 was nothing but an act of feigned distress. This was all part of his elaborate lie. There was evidence to support this. A small gap in his hospital schedule was discovered. The second surgery was supposed to take place at 9 a.m., but it was noted that Dr. Hamilton was missing, so they sent someone to remind him. This delay in the schedule pushed back the surgery. John didn't arrive at the hospital until 9:30 a.m., half an hour later than scheduled. What had he been doing at home during that time? Clearly, he had used those 30 minutes to commit the murder. A piece of evidence that suggests this happened at that time is the fact that Susan was supposed to leave the house before 9:20 a.m. She had an appointment with a friend at 9:30 a.m., but she never showed up. Moreover, she was found fully dressed, with her hair still wet, suggesting she had been getting ready to leave. It's clear that she must have been killed while John was still at home, as no one else would have had the opportunity to commit the murder while John had already left. It's important to note that they lived very close to the hospital where John worked, so it didn't take him much time to get there. When he returned to the hospital around 9:30 a.m., it meant he must have left the house before 9:20. Susan also should have left the house before 9:20, so even if she had planned to leave just 5 minutes after John, it would still have been highly unlikely for someone else to murder her during that brief time window. With all the evidence pointing to Hamilton, the jury was convinced and ready to convict him. During the trial, a surprising turn of events occurred. Bloodstains were found on the sleeve of John's shirt, discovered by an expert hired by Hamilton's defense team to examine the blood evidence on his clothes. To the surprise of many, when asked by the defense lawyer if there was anything the prosecution had overlooked, the expert, unable to avoid the truth, admitted that the bloodstains were likely caused by a blunt object strike. This revelation solved the case, as it came from someone who was meant to assist Hamilton in avoiding jail time. The expert's testimony led to the conclusion that the blood on the inside of the sleeve could only have been there at the time Susan was murdered. There was no other plausible explanation. Ultimately, John Hamilton was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Additionally, he was ordered to pay $11,104 to cover the costs of his incarceration in the county jail. This was the first case of its kind in the history of the county. Furthermore, he has previously requested a retrial, which has been denied each time. John Hamilton has never admitted to killing his wife, and still has supporters who believe he is innocent. What do you think? Do you believe Hamilton received the punishment he deserved? That's the end of this story. Thank you for listening all the way through. If you like what I do, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next episode. Thank you in advance, and see you next time. Goodbye.